We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Blind Mules at the Supreme Court. It is not a Disney movie. It is a case being heard by the justices coming up. And to discuss all things legal, as we often do on the show, we're joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Mr. Scott DiCrescenzo, also host of the excellent Uprising podcast, who's here to tell us who blinded the mules, which Disney production they're starring in, and what's happening. Scott?
Well, this is not about humans identifying as four-legged creatures and arguing appellate
Not
cases.
that there's anything wrong with that?
Not that there's anything wrong with that. Instead, this is about a woman who was caught while traveling from Mexico to the United States in a car, and authorities found, I think, close to 30 kilograms of methamphetamine in the car. They charged her with it, and during her criminal trial, she argued that she had no knowledge that those drugs were in the vehicle. It was not her car. It happened to be her boyfriend's car, and there was whether you believe her or not, there was some plausible story she offered about why she was driving this vehicle at this time. And again, not her car. So how do you impute the knowledge that she had the drugs to her, which is an element of the crime? The government has to prove part of the convicting her includes proving an element that she knew what she was doing, right? We don't prosecute unwitting or unknowing drug couriers in this country. Well, what they did is they bring in an expert from the DEA that says, well, these cars, you have to sort of paint a scene, and I want to sort of make you think about it this way. So you're in the courtroom, and they build up this person, this Ms. X from the DEA, and Ms. X we talk about her 20, 30-year history there, and like super expert in the cartels and liaison with Mexican and Colombia law enforcement, and leading up to this great crescendo of now, would a Mexican cartel unwittingly would they leave 25 to 30 kilograms of methamphetamine with someone who didn't know? Would they do that? And they say, well, no, typically we don't ever see them doing that. It's too great a risk for them. The person could do anything with that vehicle and the cartel might not know. And so it imputes to the juror's mind that the expert is testifying about this particular defendant, but they're not. And if you think about it in another way, like if you were charged with assaulting your neighbor, for instance, would the police be allowed to come by and say, well, we don't know if Mark assaulted his neighbor, but typically anytime somebody's assaulted, it's always the neighbor to the north or something like that, right? Like, That's just how it works. Well, they're imputing guilt to you, but there's been no actual evidence or proof that you are a guilty party. And so this has been allowed under I see you want to come in?
I do. That strikes me, Scott, as particularly dangerous road of prosecution to go down, because you're convicting people. Now, the young lady in question, she might in fact be guilty. I have no idea, but I don't think it really matters, because
this has nothing to do with her guilt. This has only to do with whether the government is allowed to basically send somebody to court and say, people like this are usually guilty.
Well,
that's what they're saying.
Yeah, what they're doing here, Scott, is that they're taking a generalization and using it to persecute or criminally convict somebody based on a generalization, or another way of looking at it is a statistic. Now, don't get me wrong here, Scott. I'm all for statistics, but if we start prosecuting people and convicting people based on statistics rather than an actual crime, I fear that way lies madness, doesn't it?
Mark, it seems,
or salvation, depending on how you look.
It seems to me this is an outrage, and I would just like everybody listening or watching to think about if they were being tried for some criminal charge and the government was able to bring some expert in that had no evidence that they did the crime, but just testified that people like them typically do these crimes. And of course, the inference for the jurors is then to believe that the particular defendant did this crime because of that evidence. It seems
men with beards typically commit this particular type of crime. Therefore, everybody with a beard is probably guilty. Mm-hmm. Now, Scott, what I find confusing is that this has actually made it to the Supreme Court. I'm not sure how that process would work in this particular case, because surely the this would have been appealed at a lower court first, and it stood in the lower court, in another court, an appellate court.
This has never been successfully appealed, and so that's why we're here now. And you have to remember, Mark, all the kind of pieces have to fall in together to get to the court, right? That's one of the reasons why we have, for many issues that people are kind of like rooting for a case to go to the Supreme Court, like a guns case or something like that, or abortion or any number of the other, like, really, this isn't typically a hot button, this particular evidentiary issue.
Pineapple on pizza. Yeah.
But you have to have the right set of facts that, this is an isolated issue. It's the only issue present on appeal, and you have a court that wants the case. They voted to take it.
So, Scott, when the justices hear the arguments on this and when they make their determination, it seems to me this could go two ways. One, they can determine that it was impermissible for the government to put forward a witness that would speak in generalizations because that would impute certain information towards the jury. And that's quite a clear-cut ending to the case. However, if the justices determine that they were allowed to do it, doesn't that mean that government cases will do this more and more and more, and to the detriment of civil liberty in the country?
You make an interesting point, Mark. If prosecutors,
if I were determined to put people who I felt were guilty away, I would be doing that every time.
Yes, but this goes to this. Yeah. I think that you may be overstating the universe of evidence that this is applicable to, but at the same time, it's quite troubling. I think that I clearly, if it's not obvious, hope and think that the court should disallow this kind of evidence, because I think it violates people's right to a fair trial by putting on a lay jury the level of sophistication required to disregard this kind of evidence, and I don't think it should be on them to do so. I think that's an appropriate role for the judge to say, no, it's more likely that a jury is going to see this evidence as applied against the particular defendant rather than as kind of generalized statistical information.
Yeah, I never underestimate the deviousness of those who seek to undermine civil liberties. Now, Scott, if I may, I know you hate giving predictions on cases, but I think in this one, as you say, there's a very specific set of evidentiary elements to it. What's your prediction?
Well, one of the things, I don't know that I'm predicting this, but I'm with keen interest, we'll be seeing whether or not we get a kind of merging of the wings of the court on this to agree, meaning it seems like this would appeal to both a Justice Sotomayor and a Justice Gorsuch, for instance, but from kind of atypical partners in seeing much of the constitutional law, and that's just sort of an interesting angle because it's an anti-establishment kind of a thing and also a lefty kind of a thing, right? These sorts of protections, and so I'll be curious to see if there's a marriage of the minds there when the opinion comes out.
When worlds collide at the Supreme Court, and we've got just enough time for one more quick question, Scott. Guns. There's stuff happening with guns at the Supreme Court. Give me the quick rundown.
Well, the big news, I think, since we've spoken last is that they took a bump stock case. This is, of course, Donald Trump's leading the banning of the bump stocks by just signing his pen to a regulation that said what was previously legal and ruled upon as legal by the ATF. So bump stock manufacturers asked the ATF, so they said, is this what we want to do? Is this okay and permissible under state law or under federal law? And they got letters that said, yes, it is okay. And then later on, through a new interpretation of the law under the Trump administration, it removed these rights from gun owners and made them instant felons if they continued to possess these devices. That's now gone up to the Supreme Court, I think out of the Fifth Circuit. And I think it's great that they're going to settle it. And once again, I think it's probably not hard to think, not hard to imagine which way I think they should rule on it. Given that, one day Americans were, according to their government, legally able to possess this thing. And then the next day they were told, no, you're a felon if you do. Oh, and by the way, no compensation. So there, we have a takings clause that says if the government wants to take your property for public use, and I think canceling its legality might be considered a taking. So anyway, fascinating issues there as well.
Scott will be writing on this on the pages of libertynation.com and no doubt discussing it on, as I mentioned again, the excellent Uprising podcast. Do go and listen to it. Scott, thanks ever so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to say a special thank you to our guests, Graham J. Noble, Dave Patterson, and Scott DeCosenza for taking the time to come into the studio and join us here on the show. And of course, I'd like to extend my thanks to you, the listeners out there in Radioland who take the time every week to tune in and join us for these fun discussions. Once again, thank you all, and we'll see you soon.
We dismiss history at our peril. Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.